The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical prayer as Danielle Ross moved through Seattle General's corridors like water finding its level, no wasted motion, no hesitation, just the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that urgency and panic were two different languages. She didn't rush. Rushing got people killed. She'd learned that in Tikrit, learned it in the burning streets where the choice between speed and precision meant the difference between a soldier going home and a flag-draped coffin. Here in Savannah, in this climate-controlled tower of beeping machines and fluorescent certainty, she moved the same way, smooth, purposeful, invisible. The early shift at Seattle General demanded a specific kind of invisibility. The ICU on the 4th floor ran on rhythm, a rhythm Danielle had mastered within the first week, though the other nurses attributed her competence to intuition rather than to 18 months of combat trauma medicine in a forward operating base where resources didn't exist and improvisation was the only option. She checked the 4 lines on bed for C with fingers that never wavered, hand steady as a surgical laser, despite the way her chest tightened every time she entered that room. The elderly man sleeping there, General James Whitmore, according to his chart, had dementia that had hollowed him out like a house stripped of its furniture. He lay beneath a thin hospital blanket, his skin the color of old newspaper, and on his right forearm, barely visible beneath the edge of his gown, was a tattoo in block letters, Ross. Beneath it, a date. 6 years ago. Tikrit. She did not linger. She adjusted the bear hugger warming blanket, noted his core temperature on the chart, and moved to the next room. But her hand, as she stepped into the hallway, found the fabric inside her jacket, the faded unit patch sewn into the lining, pressed against her ribs like a heartbeat from another life. Worn cotton and threadbare embroidery. The symbol of the 1st Battalion, 3rd Marines. Her fingers traced it once, twice, the texture rough and familiar as bone. Then she let it go. The supply closet on the northwest corner of 4 West had the kind of silence that made it useful for thinking. Danielle stood among the boxes of gauze and the stacked fur poles, breathing in the medicinal smell of disinfectant and plastic. 3 months. She'd been embedded at Seattle General for exactly 91 days. Naval intelligence had placed her here to quietly monitor General Whitmore's security after credible threats against high-ranking officers receiving care at civilian medical facilities. The dementia was convenient in its way. He couldn't recognize faces, couldn't articulate secrets, couldn't blow her cover by calling her by any of the 6 names she'd held across her career. But his body remembered. The tattoo on his arm was a thing that lived outside his failing mind, a permanent record of a moment she carried in her own nervous system like shrapnel under skin. She was replacing the 4 pump batteries when she heard the voice. Fascinating that she worked so efficiently without proper oversight. The voice belonged to Dr. Richard Mercer, and it carried the specific tone of a man accustomed to being the smartest person in every room. Danielle heard him before seeing him, the crisp rustle of his white coat, the expensive leather of his shoes on the tile floor, the way his presence seemed to make the air pressure change slightly, as if his confidence occupied physical space. He stood in the ICU entrance with a resident trailing behind him, a young man named Chen who looked perpetually terrified. Mercer's eyes found Danielle immediately, tracked her the way a predator tracks movement at the edge of a clearing. She continued her work. The residents shifted their weight. The monitors beeped their steady electronic rhythm. "Is there something you need, Doctor?" She asked it without looking up, keeping her voice the texture of neutral sand, the voice she'd learned to use in circumstances where authority flowed only in one direction. Mercer smiled. It wasn't a warm expression. "I was merely observing that our nursing staff seems to operate with remarkable autonomy." Almost, he paused, letting the word settle like sediment, like physicians. Danielle finished checking the pump settings. She turned to face him, her shoulders relaxed, her expression open in a way that cost her nothing because it was the expression of someone who had learned to give nothing away. "I've been a registered nurse for 7 years, Doctor. I'm credentialed for these assessments." "Of course." His smile widened. It was the smile of someone testing a hypothesis. "Though I wonder if there isn't some confusion about the difference between credentials and actual clinical judgment. Chen, do you see what Miss Ross just did?" He gestured toward the 4 pump with the casual dismissal of someone accustomed to being obeyed. She adjusted the infusion rate without a physician's direct authorization. Fascinating breach of protocol. Chen's face flushed. The resident was 28 years old and still carried the wound-tight anxiety of someone constantly afraid of failing upward. He looked at Danielle, then back at Mercer, then at his shoes. "I was checking the settings against the current order," Danielle said. Her voice remained steady. The pump was delivering 40 milliliters per hour. The current order specifies 60. And you felt empowered to make that adjustment independently. I felt obligated to correct an error that could compromise patient safety. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Mercer nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they've identified a useful weakness. "I see. Well, we'll need to discuss this during grand rounds. Come along, Chen." He didn't wait for a response. He simply turned and walked back toward the nurse's station, his white coat trailing like something with its own momentum, and Chen scrambled to follow, shooting an apologetic glance over his shoulder. Danielle returned to the battery replacement, her fingers moving with the same calm precision they'd always held. She did not think about the way Mercer had looked at her. She did not think about the calculation in his eyes. She did not think about the faded patch inside her jacket or the man in 4C who wore her name on his arm like a prayer he no longer remembered how to speak. What she did think about was that Mercer had made a choice. He'd decided that she represented something that needed to be dismantled. And he'd decided to do it with the methodical precision of a man who understood institutional power the way a conductor understands an orchestra. This wasn't casual workplace friction. This was someone drawing a line and deciding who belonged on which side. The ICU hummed its mechanical rhythm. Across the city, rain threatened to fall. And in room 4C, General Whitmore slept the deep sleep of a man whose mind had already surrendered to the merciful confusion of dementia, unaware that the woman who'd held his life together on the streets of Tikrit was moving through the same hospital, compartmentalized into a role too small to contain her, marked only by the faded patch of thread against her ribs and the way her hands never shook even when everything inside was fracturing like ice. Danielle finished her rounds at 14:27. 42 patients across 2 ICU wings. She documented each vital sign, each medication administration, each moment of clinical assessment with the precision of someone who understood that records were evidence, that notation was protection, that the paper trail was the only thing standing between competence and accusation. By the time she clocked out at 15:30, she'd already filed away the specifics of the encounter with Mercer, catalogued his tone and timing and methodology. He was competent. That made him dangerous in ways that stupid antagonism never could. Stupid was predictable. Competent was a problem that required strategy. She drove through the gathering Savannah afternoon, past the oak trees dripping with Spanish moss, past the rain that was starting to spit against her windshield with the fury of something with a score to settle. Her daughter was waiting at the after-school facility, her small face pressed against the glass door, watching for the familiar car. Emma was 7 years old and had learned early not to ask questions about the work that kept her mother moving through hospitals at odd hours, coming home with stories that didn't quite make sense, with a careful distance that Emma had never learned to bridge. "Mommy." The word came out in that particular way that 7-year-olds used it, as both greeting and question, a request for confirmation that the world was still structured the way it was supposed to be. "Hey, baby." Danielle held her close, breathing in the smell of her daughter's hair, soap and some kind of crayon box shampoo she'd insisted on buying at the pharmacy. "How was school?" "Miss Crawford said I'm a good reader." "You are." "She said I read like a grown-up." "That's because you are a grown-up," Danielle said, and meant it in a way that the statement didn't quite capture. Emma had been born into a life where her mother's deployments were simply the structure of reality, where absence was as normal as presence, where the question, "When will you be home?" had to be answered with honesty instead of promises. She'd learned early to be careful with hope. She'd learned to be self-sufficient. She'd learned that love lived in small moments of actual presence rather than in grand declarations. They drove through the rain toward home, the small rental house in a quiet Savannah neighborhood where Danielle had set up the kind of life that was real enough to be credible and temporary enough to be abandoned on short notice. She thought about the patch inside her jacket. She thought about the tattoo on a dying man's arm. She thought about Dr. Mercer's smile and the methodical way he'd set about identifying her as a threat that needed neutralizing. And somewhere in the structure of that thought, in the space between the raindrops and the streetlight starting to flicker on against the grey afternoon, she made a decision. She would do her job. She would care for her patients with the precision and focus that had carried her through 18 months in Tikrit. She would move through Seattle General's corridors with the same quiet efficiency that had brought her this far. And when it became necessary, and it would become necessary, these situations always did, she would stop hiding. But that wasn't the worst part. The grand rounds began like all the others, 12 residents clustered around a patient bed in the cardiac wing, attending physicians stationed at strategic intervals like generals assessing troops. Danielle stood at the foot of the mattress, vital signs steady on the monitor behind her, BP 118/74, heart rate 62, oxygen saturation 97% on room air. The patient, a 63-year-old post-op case, stable and improving, had been her responsibility for 72 hours. 3 days of meticulous monitoring. 3 days of court problems before they escalated. Dr. Mercer arrived last, his white coat pristine, his voice carrying the kind of confidence that comes from never having heard the word no. He paused at the bedside, reading the chart with exaggerated slowness, then looked up at the residents with that smile, the one that made junior doctors straighten their spines like hunting dogs sensing a kill. "Let's discuss Nurse Ross's creative approach to patient care," he said. The words hung in the fluorescent-lit space like smoke. She ordered a full metabolic panel. Cardiac enzymes. Before physician approval. Without consultation. Without authorization. He turned to face the residents directly. "Perhaps at YouTube University, where I assume she trained, they teach nurses to practice medicine without a license." Laughter rippled through the group. Controlled. Professional. Cruel. Danielle's jaw tightened, just barely, a microscopic shift in muscle tension. Her hands remained steady on her tablet as she continued charting, her face a perfect mask of concentration. The unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, stitched there 3 months ago before she arrived in Savannah, pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat. She said nothing. The silence was her only response, and Mercer's eyes narrowed because silence was something he hadn't expected from her, not here, not in front of witnesses. What he didn't understand was that she'd been trained by people whose silence could end careers. 2 days later, the vending machine near the emergency room entrance hummed its mechanical rhythm, dispensing another afternoon for the hospital staff. Danielle fed $2 into the slot and selected black coffee, the industrial kind that tasted like burnt rubber, the kind that kept her sharp on double shifts. Around her, orderlies and techs moved with a casual drift of people who'd stopped thinking about their jobs years ago. Dr. Mercer appeared with an attending physician she'd never seen before, positioning himself directly beside the machine with the calculated positioning of someone orchestrating a scene. His voice dropped to that particular register, not quite a whisper, loud enough for everyone within 6 feet to hear every word. "Did Ross actually finish nursing school?" he said, not looking at her, "or did she just binge Grey's Anatomy and convince credentialing she was qualified? I'm genuinely curious. Has anyone actually verified her credentials, or are we operating on faith here?" The other attending laughed. A tech loading a newspaper into the recycling bin stiffened. An orderly studied his phone with sudden intensity. Danielle's knuckles whitened briefly on the coffee cup, just for a moment, a flash of tension that disappeared before anyone could name it as weakness. She picked up her beverage and walked past Mercer without breaking stride, without acknowledgement, without the satisfaction he was hunting for. She needed him to see her as beneath his notice. That was safer. That afternoon, she found him at his desk, the general's file in her hands. The signs were there if you knew how to read them, the kind of subtle deterioration that preceded catastrophic failure. Internal bleeding from an old shrapnel wound, the one he'd carried since before she pulled him out of Tikrit, before she was anything but a combat medic with dirt under her fingernails and his blood on her hands. "Dr. Mercer," she said, her voice measured and professional. "The general in 4C is showing signs of internal bleeding from his old shrapnel wound. I'm requesting an urgent consult." He looked up from his desk with that smile again, the one that meant he'd been waiting for this moment. "You're requesting?" "Yes, Doctor." "Security, please." He wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking past her, through her, at the spot on the wall where his authority felt most comfortable. "Escort this nurse out. She's harassing attending physicians." 2 guards stepped forward from the hallway. They'd been waiting, she realized. This wasn't an improvisation. This was choreography. Danielle's hands didn't shake as she turned toward the exit, the file still tucked against her chest. In the supply closet 20 minutes later, alone between boxes of saline solution and rolls of dressing tape, her hands finally trembled. She pressed her palms flat against the cool metal shelving and allowed herself exactly 4 deep breaths. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the kind that comes from 3 tours in a war zone and the knowledge that certain people couldn't be fought with the same rules they used to break you. She pulled out her phone. Encrypted line. 1 call would reach her handler within seconds. 1 conversation would burn her cover, pull her out of the hospital, send naval intelligence to evaluate what was happening with the general security. Mission failure. 3 months of careful positioning, dissolved. She didn't make the call. Instead, she documented the refused consult with steady hands. She logged her vital sign observations. She created a paper trail of her concerns in the hospital system, knowing that Mercer couldn't erase digital records without leaving traces. Then she returned to the floor, the mask back in place, her voice back to deferential, her movements back to invisible. Over the next week, Mercer's campaign became something else entirely. It evolved from public humiliation into something more surgical, more calculated. He made phone calls to the credentialing committee, his voice grave with concern about Danielle's pattern of overstepping scope of practice. In the attending lounge, positioned where his words could travel like spores through the ventilation system, he told carefully chosen colleagues that she was a lawsuit waiting to happen and dangerously confident for someone with her training. Nurses who openly respected Danielle, Linda from the night shift, Marcus from the cardiac floor, Jennifer from post-op, received sudden schedule changes. Linda was reassigned to night shift. Marcus found himself on a rotation that took him to the pediatric floor. Jennifer's shift scattered across 3 different weeks. When Marcus caught Danielle in the break room and asked what was happening, she told him to keep his head down. "Don't get involved," she said. "Not in this." The surgical schedules changed. The general was assigned post-op care by 2 different nurses, neither of whom was Danielle, though she held ICU seniority that should have made her the default assignment. When she questioned the charge nurse about it, the woman looked genuinely uncomfortable, caught between honesty and survival. "It came from above," the charge nurse said. "I'm sorry. I don't have a choice." Danielle reviewed the general's chart remotely. The hospital record system allowed her access even when she wasn't assigned to his direct care. She noted the subtle changes that made her military training scream warnings. Heart rate trending up. Blood pressure trending down. Markers in his latest lab work suggesting the old shrapnel wound was destabilizing, that internal bleeding was beginning and no one was watching for it except a nurse they'd systematically isolated from his care. She documented everything. Not in formal assessments where Mercer would see them, she'd lost that privilege when he threw her out of his office. Instead, she logged observations in the patient portal comments where only other nurses would find them, breadcrumbs of clinical concern that created a pattern if anyone bothered to read it carefully. But they wouldn't read it. Not without pressure. Not without someone forcing them to. The supply closet became her private place, the one space in Seattle General where the mask didn't have to hold. Her hands trembled for exactly 90 seconds each time, then steadied. She would pull out her phone, stare at the encrypted contact, and then slide it back into her pocket. Her assignment was to protect him. Blowing her cover meant mission failure, meant the threats against high-ranking officers in civilian facilities went unchecked, meant naval intelligence had wasted 3 months and a trained operative on a cover that was now compromised anyway. She steadied her breathing and returned to the floor, mask back in place, voice back to deferential, movements back to invisible. The faded unit patch pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat, like a promise she'd made to someone she couldn't remember saving because he couldn't remember her face. The monitors screamed first. 2 hallways away, Danielle heard them, not the routine beep-beep-beep of a stable patient, but the urgent staccato of a code, the sound of a body betraying itself. She didn't stop to ask permission. She didn't stop for anything. Room 4C was chaos wrapped in fluorescent light. The crash cart stood at the foot of the general's bed like a steel monument to panic. 3 residents circled him, their movements uncertain, their voices climbing over each other in a particular way that meant nobody knew what they were looking at. The monitors painted his story in red, blood pressure 68/42 and falling, oxygen saturation dropping like a stone, heart rate climbing toward 160 before the monitor couldn't track it anymore. Possible MI, a second-year resident stammered, hands frozen above the defibrillation pads. We need to. Rhythms not cardiac, another voice said, uncertain. I don't know what this is. The general lay motionless, his weathered face the color of old paper. Danielle had reviewed his file enough times to know what they were missing. 73 years old. Decorated service record. Shrapnel wound to the anterior chest from a convoy attack outside Tikrit, 2005. The wound had been surgically repaired, the fragments removed, but shrapnel didn't always announce when it was moving. She pushed into the room. No one stopped her. No one even looked at her. In a code, the hierarchy collapsed into a simple question: can you help? Do you know what to do? Everything else fell away. The general's chest wall was discolored near his left anterior axilla, the skin mottled with bruising that hadn't been there during morning rounds. His pressure dropped to 60. His lips were already developing a dusky hue. The sound of his breathing, shallow, rapid, wet, told her everything. Not cardiac arrest. Hemorrhagic shock. Internal bleed. The old wound rupturing. It's the shrapnel injury, Danielle said. Her voice cut through the panic like a scalpel through silk. Rupturing internally. He's bleeding out into his chest cavity. The resident stared at her. That's not, the film was clear yesterday. Pressure's 50/30, she said. Not an argument. Not a discussion. A statement of fact. He's got maybe 4 minutes before cardiac arrest becomes permanent. Get the OR team. Now. Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway as if summoned by the chaos itself. His presence shifted something in the room, a tensing, a hesitation. He saw Danielle at the bedside, saw her hands moving across the general's chest, saw the confidence she carried like a badge. His face darkened from the color of healthy flesh to the color of a tomato left in the sun. Step back, he said. Not to anyone in particular. To her. You have no authority here. Leave the room now or I'm calling security. The monitors screamed. The general's pressure dropped another notch. The code team looked between Danielle and Mercer, paralyzed by the particular helplessness of people watching power contests while their patient died. Danielle met Mercer's eyes. She saw what he was, a man who believed titles meant more than training, credentials more than instinct, hierarchy more than lives. She saw someone who would sacrifice a general on the altar of his own authority rather than admit that a nurse with no initials after her name could see what he could not. She made her choice in the space of a single heartbeat. She moved past him, not around him, not deferentially to the side, but directly through the space he occupied, her shoulder brushing his as she reached for the crash cart. His hand came up to block her, muscle memory of fights he'd never actually had. She didn't acknowledge the gesture. Her hand found the sterile field. Found the scalpel. You just ended your career, Mercer hissed. Danielle didn't answer. She was already moving in ways her body remembered better than her conscious mind could explain. Hands that had held the dying in Tikrit, hands that had learned anatomy by touch in places where there was no time for precision imaging, hands that carried muscle memory older than her cover story. The incision started at the general's left anterior axilla and ran down toward the 5th intercostal space in one smooth motion, not hesitant, not searching, but certain. The scalpel moved like it was on rails, like gravity itself was guiding it. The skin parted. Subcutaneous tissue. Pectoralis major. Through the fascia. The ribs beneath, pale bone wrapped in muscle. Retractors, she said. No one moved. Retractors. Now. A resident's hands moved without his brain's permission. Self-retaining retractor. She positioned it, twisted the handles, opened the chest cavity with the methodical precision of someone who had done this under fire, under rain, under the kind of pressure that separated living from legend. The blood came first, dark, arterial, the color of crisis. She could see why the initial team had frozen. The anatomy of a bullet wound, even one 5 years old, could be chaos. The surgeon's repair had been textbook, but shrapnel had a way of migrating, of hiding, of waiting for the right moment of exertion or inflammation or simple bad luck to start its slow work of destruction. The bleeding was coming from the anterior chest wall, from one of the smaller arteries the original team had probably thought they'd adequately controlled. Thought. Past tense. Medical certainty that had expired the moment the general's wall had ruptured. She applied direct pressure with gauze, her left hand steady as the packing, her right hand already reaching for Bovie, she said. Someone thrust the electrocautery unit into her hand. She pressed it against the bleeding source. The sound was small, almost delicate, the hiss like escaping steam, the smell of burning tissue filling the room like a signature. The bleeding stopped. The monitors changed their scream. Pressure climbing. 62/40. 70/48. The rhythm stabilizing from frantic to merely urgent. The general's oxygen saturation ticking upward like a prayer answered. Surgeons on the way, a resident whispered. ETA 3 minutes. Danielle kept her hand steady, kept the pressure maintained, kept her breathing even. The room had gone so quiet she could hear the hum of the ventilator, the soft beep of the now normal heart rate, Mercer's breathing, shallow and rapid, the sound of a man watching the impossible become possible. The surgeons arrived like a rescue. Danielle stepped back as they took over, the handoff smooth as a choreography rehearsed 1,000 times. They saw what she'd done, saw the open chest cavity, saw the bleeding controlled and the anatomy preserved. Who opened? The attending surgeon asked, a woman with grey threading through her dark hair and the kind of presence that made you straighten your spine without meaning to. I did, Danielle said. The surgeon looked at her. Really looked at her. Then she looked at the general, at the pressure readings ticking steadily upward, at the textbook perfect exposure and bleeding control. You saved his life, the surgeon said simply. He would have coded in the next 2 minutes. He would have bled out before we could even open him in the OR. She turned to her team. Let's move him. I want vascular standing by. We're going to need repair of that artery. They took him to the operating room with Danielle's work still holding him together. The door swung closed. The hallway emptied. And Danielle turned to find Dr. Mercer staring at her with an expression that looked a lot like a man watching his entire worldview collapse. You performed surgery, he said. Slowly. As if speaking to someone who didn't understand English. Field thoracotomy, she said. Her voice was different now. Cleaner. Sharper. The careful deferential nurse had been replaced by something else, something that sounded like a person who had held someone's heart in their hands while bombs fell. Internal hemorrhage. Ruptured shrapnel wound. Anterior mammary artery. He had for minutes before irreversible shock. I had instruments and training. She paused. He's alive because of what I did in the last 10 minutes. Everything else is conversation. Mercer's mouth opened. Closed. The residents watched. The code team watched. Everyone saw the moment his confidence, his authority, his entire carefully constructed sense of superiority cracked like ice under an increasing load. The surgeons arrived at the trauma bay with the general already prepped and draped, blood-soaked gauze still clutched in Danielle's hands. One surgeon glanced at the monitor, at the perfectly placed cross-clamp holding the bleeding vessel, at vital signs that should have been flatlined but instead climbed steadily upward. He didn't ask who had done the procedure. He didn't need to. The work was flawless. The general was wheeled toward the OR within 40 seconds, and as the stretcher disappeared through the double doors, one resident whispered to another that thoracotomy was textbook perfect. Where did Ross learn? But Danielle was already moving toward the supply room, peeling off her gloves, her face a mask of calm that would have fooled anyone who didn't understand that composure like that didn't come from nursing school. It came from having saved lives in places where the music of monitors was replaced by the percussion of small arms fire. Within 2 hours, Danielle's phone buzzed with an urgent summons to the director's office. She had known it would come. The moment she'd made the decision to respond to that code, the moment she'd picked up a scalpel and operated without a physician's order, she had set events in motion that no amount of composure could stop. What she didn't know was that Dr. Mercer had already been on the phone before the general's chest had even been closed in the operating room. His calls were methodical, calculated. The kind of offensive that came not from rage but from a man who understood leverage and how to weaponize policy. First, he called the credentialing committee chair at home, a personal call, voice smooth as oil, discussing concerning patterns of scope creep and a nurse acting far beyond her training. He didn't describe the emergency. He described an incident. An overreach. A threat to institutional liability. The chair listened because Mercer had on his side 3 decades of medical authority, the kind that made administrators nervous. Second, he contacted hospital administration, filing a formal written complaint before Danielle's blood pressure had even normalized. Third, and most methodically, he began the process of systematically dismantling her support structure. Within 24 hours, every nurse who had worked closely with Danielle, who had deferred to her clinical judgment, who had respected her instinctive competence, was quietly reassigned to different floors. Not transferred, reassigned, as if they had simply been scheduled elsewhere all along. Chen, who had assisted on the code and whispered admiration, moved to pediatrics on the night shift. Rodriguez, who had handed her instruments without hesitation, reassigned to the outpatient clinic 3 miles away. Wallace, the senior RN who had mentored her through her first month, told she was needed in the ICU across the hospital, immediately. The whisper network that had protected and supported Danielle dissolved like morning fog under a brutal sun. Isolation is a weapon, and Mercer wielded it like a man who had studied how systems destroy people from the inside. The surgery schedule shifted too. Post-operative protocols suddenly required that another nurse, someone Mercer could trust, someone he had influenced, would handle the general's recovery care. Not Danielle. Never Danielle. The schedule was reworked with the precision of a chess grandmaster removing a piece from the board. She would have no access to her patient. No continuation of care. No way to verify that he was safe. It was strategic suffocation, designed to look like standard procedure while ensuring that she had no defense, no proof of involvement, no ground to stand on if she tried to explain what she had done and why. That afternoon, the director's office was silent except for the tick of a wall clock and the hiss of the HVAC system. Danielle sat in a chair that cost more than she made in a month, across from a man whose regret was genuine but whose institutional loyalty ran deeper. He slid a folder across the desk. Her termination packet. The charges were listed in administrative language so precise it sounded like law, performing medical procedures outside her scope of practice, insubordination, potential patient endangerment, violation of hospital protocol, acting without physician authorization. Dr. Mercer has filed a formal complaint with the state board, the director said quietly. He's also recommended that we contact the nursing license board in your state. He's very thorough. Captain Ross. He had almost said her military rank. The slip hung in the air like a mistake neither of them could take back. Your response to this incident was heroic. I think that's the word. But legally, I cannot defend it. The liability alone, if anything had gone wrong, if you had nicked the phrenic nerve, if there had been any complication at all, this hospital would be responsible. And frankly, the Board of Trustees, they're not comfortable with the precedent. Danielle sat motionless. Her hands rested on her thighs, calm as stone. Somewhere in her chest, beneath the ribs that had carried her through Tikrit and Kandahar and 3 years of undercover work, something fractured. But her voice when she spoke was steady. "I understand," she said. "Do you want to explain your actions? I could include a statement in your file." The director leaned forward slightly, offering her a lifeline he didn't understand she couldn't take. To defend herself, to explain, to detail the hours of advanced trauma certification and the muscle memory of field surgery, all of it would require revealing that her position at Seattle General had never been about nursing. That she had been placed here by naval intelligence. That the 7-year-old who waited for her at home after school had a mother whose real job involved protecting things that didn't appear in hospital directories or payroll systems. "No statement necessary," Danielle said. Security walked her out at 3:22 p.m. The badge she had worn for 3 months was deactivated with an audible click. The plastic lanyard was handed back, as if the gesture contained some kindness. She carried a box of personal items from her locker, a change of scrubs, a half-empty bottle of ibuprofen, her phone charger, and the faded unit patch sewn deep inside her jacket lining, where no one at the hospital had ever known to look. The nurses who passed her in the corridor looked away. One, a younger resident, made eye contact for half a second before shame pulled her gaze down. Whispers followed her toward the exit like a wake. They didn't know what they were witnessing. They thought they were watching a nurse being fired for overstepping. They didn't know they were watching a mission collapse. They didn't know they were watching a classified operation burn to ash because a surgeon needed to control the room more than he needed to let a patient live. The drive home was silent except for the sound of rain hammering the windshield. October rain. The kind that came down like criticism. Danielle's hands gripped the steering wheel at exactly 10 and 2, every micro-movement controlled, every emotion meticulously compartmentalized. She had been trained to absorb punishment. She had been trained to operate with broken ribs and partial hearing loss and the weight of decisions that would haunt her forever. But she had not been trained for this particular variety of failure. For the moment when the thing you were supposed to protect slipped through your fingers because you had been too visible, too competent, too willing to break protocol for the right reasons. The apartment was small. A rental furnished with pieces from thrift stores and the kind of second-hand couch that held the faint ghosts of other people's lives. Emma was not home yet. The neighbor, Mrs. Chen, would keep her until 5 o'clock. That gave Danielle 1 hour and 13 minutes to somehow transform herself into a woman whose world had not just ended. She sat at the kitchen table instead. The afternoon light cut through the cheap blinds in brutal geometric lines, and Danielle let herself break in a way she had not permitted since Tikrit. Her shoulders curved inward. Her hands, those steady surgical hands, trembled slightly as they covered her face. The tears came quietly, the way everything in her life came, without announcement, without apology, with only the kind of anguish that came from having spent her entire adult life doing what needed to be done, making the impossible choice, and then being told that the choice had been wrong. The termination letter sat on the table, and she stared at it through watered vision. Her mission status would be flagged as failed. Her deployment would be terminated. Everything she had built here, every contact, every subtle protection she had provided, every quiet night she had ensured for her patient, erased because one surgeon decided that his ego was more important than institutional procedure. At 4:52 p.m., she heard small footsteps in the hallway outside, then the sound of a key in the lock. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, backpack slung over one shoulder, her 7-year-old face still carrying the innocence of someone who had not yet learned that the world took things without asking. Her eyes moved from her mother's face to the unopened termination packet to the barely contained devastation that no amount of composure could hide. "Mommy." Emma's voice was small, tentative. "Why are you home? Your shift isn't over yet. Did you get hurt?" She set her backpack down carefully, the way children do when they sense something terrible and want to move slowly, as if speed would make it worse. "Mommy, why are you crying?" Danielle's breath caught. She had not cried in front of her daughter in 3 years. Emma would not understand. Emma knew only that her mother was steady, capable, someone who could be trusted with anything including silence about things that mattered. And now here sat Danielle, tears on her face, her military identity burning like a classified document in a fireplace, and her daughter asking the simplest question in the world. "Come here, baby," Danielle whispered. She pulled Emma into her lap despite the girl's confusion, despite the way Emma's small body went rigid with worry. Danielle held her while the afternoon light moved across the kitchen and her phone, sitting dormant on the counter, began to gather the notifications that would eventually cascade up from the Pentagon. A routine background check at 3 in the morning flagged something buried so deep it should have stayed classified. Captain Danielle Ross. Security clearance level TST SCI, active duty naval intelligence. The hospital's credentialing system sent an automatic alert up the chain of command, and by dawn, that alert had traveled through 17 channels and landed on a Pentagon desk. By 8 a.m., it reached Admiral Catherine Thorne's office. By 9, a Marine lieutenant was in a Black Hawk heading toward Savannah. Dr. Mercer didn't know any of this yet. The general opened his eyes at 10:56 a.m., his mind clearing for the first time since the rupture. The monitors showed stable vitals. The swelling in his brain had decreased. He lay in the recovery suite on the 4th floor, afternoon light cutting through the blinds like clean cuts through silk, and he blinked slowly, remembering nothing of the code, nothing of the woman who'd saved him, but when Danielle entered to check his full line, quiet, efficient, her movements like water finding its level, something ancient in his nervous system recognized her. His eyes tracked her across the room. His hand moved toward hers. And in a voice that hadn't worked in 6 years, he whispered one word, "Falcon." The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator's steady wheeze. Danielle's hand stilled on the 4 pump. Her jaw tightened once, imperceptibly. She didn't turn around. She finished logging the medication and walked out without speaking, which was exactly what training required, except her fingers were trembling, not from fear, but from something deeper, something that had been sealed away in Tikrit and had no business being unsealed now. She made it to the supply closet, locked the door, pressed her palm against her ribs where the unit patch lay against her heart, and breathed until her hand steadied again. 3 minutes. That was all she allowed herself. When she returned to the 4th floor, there were boots on the tile that hadn't been there before. A Marine lieutenant stood beside the general's bed, dress uniform pressed sharp enough to draw blood, and behind him stood a second officer with the kind of bearing that meant command. The lieutenant held a leather folder embossed with a seal. He was reading aloud, his voice carrying into the hallway where staff had begun to gather, where nurses and orderlies and a respiratory therapist all moved slowly, drawn to something they sensed without understanding. The words echoed off the tile. Captain Danielle Ross, for actions under fire while extracting wounded personnel from hostile territory. For maintaining operational integrity under extreme duress. For valor in service to this nation. The lieutenant opened the folder. Inside lay medals on crimson ribbon. Bronze Star. He paused. The hallway was absolutely still. Silver Star. Another pause. 2 purple hearts. The general's eyes were wet now, and the lieutenant's voice dropped lower, more deliberate. And a Navy Cross. Mercer pushed through the gathered staff before the ceremony was finished. His face had gone the color of old bone. He moved toward the lieutenant with his hands raised, his mouth already shaping objections, his voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel through healthy tissue. This is a patient care violation. This is harassment of medical staff. I'm calling security right now to end this spectacle. He was looking at the Navy insignia like it was a paper crown. Like it meant nothing against his authority. Like the badges and medals and formal language were some kind of performance he could interrupt and dismiss. The general stood. Slowly. His hand found the bedside rail and he pulled himself up, muscles still weak from surgery but will stronger than flesh, and he looked directly at Danielle. Really looked at her. 67 years old, his mind rebuilt itself in those 3 seconds, and he saw not the nurse in blue scrubs but the captain in dust-covered combat fatigues pulling him out of a burning vehicle in Tikrit, her hand steady on a tourniquet while rounds snapped past her head. His arm rose, trembling, into a perfect salute. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of recognition across 6 years and dementia and surgery and pain. "Thank you, Captain." Mercer's mouth moved but nothing came out. The Pentagon liaison arrived at 11:32 a.m., a colonel in dress blue alphas, and he walked directly to the hospital board conference room where the chief of staff and 2 administrators sat frozen at their desks. He placed a folder in front of them and used language that made the room pressure change. Captain Danielle Ross was placed at Seattle General under Operation Sentinel 7. Her presence here was not negotiable. Her removal was a federal matter you've already created liability for. Every decision made about her placement, her assignment, her termination, those are now under Pentagon review. One of the administrators went pale. Not because of the words, but because she suddenly understood what they meant. They had fired a decorated Navy officer on orders from a man with no actual authority to demand it. They had terminated an active duty service member based on false claims from a civilian physician. The liability wasn't in the money, it was in the exposure. By 2 p.m., a video had reached Reddit, Twitter, and TikTok. Shot on someone's phone from the hallway's edge, it captured Mercer's face in the moment before he spoke, contempt sharp as a weapon, privilege so visible it cast a shadow. It captured his objections in real time while the general stood at attention. It captured the moment Danielle's eyes met the general's eyes and something that had been broken for 6 years came back together. The video was captioned, "Doctor interrupts military honors for nurse veteran who saved general's life." By 4 p.m., it had been viewed 58,000 times. By 5 p.m., it had reached Dr. Catherine Harlow's inbox. She was Mercer's medical school mentor, the surgeon who'd taught him that competence and compassion were not separate things but the same instrument in different hands. She'd written his recommendation letters. She believed in him once. She watched the video 3 times, her expression hardening with each viewing, and then she picked up the phone. She called the hospital board. She called the medical licensing authority. And she sent a letter, formal, devastating, each sentence landing like a surgical strike. "I taught him to heal. He chose cruelty instead. I recommend immediate review of his conduct and revocation of his privileges." The hospital opened an emergency investigation by 6 p.m. Markers came forward with emails. Linda provided recordings, Mercer's voice, clear and documented, making comments about Danielle that crossed lines that had been established since the 1980s. Nurses described schedule changes that had obviously targeted her. The PT who'd been reassigned spoke about being told explicitly that working with Danielle was not in Mercer's favor. Every careful move he'd made, every strategic calculation, had been documented. He'd believed himself untouchable because he'd been competent at his work. He hadn't understood that competence doesn't grant exemption from accountability when the person you harm is connected to an admiral, 2 senators, and a general who whispered your call sign in gratitude. By Thursday morning, Mercer's badge was deactivated. By Friday, his privileges were suspended pending investigation. Danielle returned to the hospital Monday morning in Navy service dress uniform, the shoulders proper, the insignia catching the fluorescent light above the ER entrance. She completed the protective detail on the general, standing quietly in the hallway while he received visitors, ensuring that the threat assessment hadn't changed, that he was safe. When Mercer's office chair sat empty, when his nameplaque was removed from the door, when the staff whispered about what he'd done and who she actually was, Danielle simply continued her rounds. She didn't acknowledge him. She didn't need to. The truth had done all the speaking for her. 6 months later, when she completed her assignment and transferred to Naval Medical Center Portsmouth, the general placed 2 photographs on his Pentagon desk. One from Tikrit, 19 years earlier, Danielle in fatigues, barely recognizable. One from Seattle General, the 2 of them together, his hand on her shoulder, gratitude so visible it didn't need words. Beside them, framed, sat the faded unit patch she'd given him. A gift from someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to give. Dr. Mercer was driving a medical supply van through eastern Washington now, making deliveries between rural clinics, doing intake paperwork and inventory, his medical license suspended for 2 years, his reputation burned to ash by the mentor who'd believed in him once. When the van passed Seattle General one afternoon, he saw the banner. Honoring our veteran healthcare workers. Danielle's photo was featured. Captain. Navy. The citation beneath it listed dates and locations he recognized. He kept driving. At Portsmouth, Danielle trained combat medics. She taught the thoracotomy procedure, the angle of the knife, the way to feel for the cardiac membrane, how to restore perfusion when every system is failing. A young corpsman asked her one afternoon if it was true, if she'd really performed it in a civilian hospital under threat of termination, if she'd really saved a general's life while her own career was being destroyed. Danielle considered the question. She thought of Emma's small body going rigid with worry. She thought of the general's tears. She thought of the patch against her ribs, faded and worn and alive with meaning. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most, she said. Remember that when everything is on the line. The corpsman nodded, not yet understanding but someday would. Someday, when the pressure was absolute and the stakes were written in blood, he would remember those words and know exactly what they meant. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone whose authority blinded them to your value, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. Comment below, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong? Let's build a community that recognizes the warriors walking among us.